August 1946. I stepped off the train in the late afternoon, my boots hitting the sun-baked platform of a town that once knew my name. The war was over, the medals tucked in a pocket I didn't dare open, and the uniform I wore had more dust than glory. I came back with a folded letter inside my chest pocket, her letter. The one she wrote just before I left for the Italian front, when her hands still smelled of soap and cornmeal, and her words still believed in promises. I had promised her a home, not just a house, but something rooted. A porch that faced the west wind, rows of tomatoes in the garden, a kitchen that always smelled of bread and Sunday laughter. I promised her children, a dog, a swing set I would build myself. I promised her that no matter what the war took, I would come back and give her the one thing no one could steal from us, a life. But when I crossed the old wooden trestle over Silver Creek, the same bridge we used to skip stones under, I knew something was wrong. The paint on the general store had faded to a dusty shell. The windows of the church were boarded up. Even the wind seemed quieter, like it didn't want to disturb what little was left. There were no kids playing by the roadside, no smell of biscuits from the Mayfield's kitchen, just the creaking of a broken gate and the buzz of summer cicadas that sounded less like home and more like warning. Her house, the one with the green shutters, was still standing, but the porch swing was gone, the mailbox hung crooked, and the curtains had been drawn tight. I stood there, hand on the gate, staring like a man waiting for something that had already passed. An old neighbor passed by. He looked at me, looked down, and kept walking. No handshake, no welcome, just a shadow of recognition. And then someone behind a screen door whispered, "She married someone else, thought he died in Italy." The war had ended, but peace hadn't come with it. People were rationing hope now, handing it out in smaller and smaller doses. I had walked across Europe thinking of her. Now I was a ghost, returning to a place where the living had already buried me. If this story touches you the way it touched me writing it, please leave a like and subscribe. It helps us keep sharing stories that move, inspire, and stay with you. And now, prepare yourself, because what comes next changes everything. The streets were smaller than I remembered, not just narrower, but quieter, as if time had folded the whole town in on itself while I was away. Or maybe it was me who had stretched. Years of marching in places with names I couldn't pronounce, sleeping in foxholes with strangers who never woke up, watching entire cities burn. Maybe that's what made the houses here feel too close, too fragile. I walked past Mr. Hendrick's old hardware store, or what was left of it. The awning had collapsed on one side, the windows were caked in dust, and someone had boarded up the door with mismatched planks of wood. A handwritten sign still clung to the glass. "Gone to war. Be back soon." I guess soon stretched out longer than anyone planned. The barber shop was gone. The soda fountain had closed. Even the train station, the one I'd left from in 1942, with her waving goodbye and a red ribbon in her hair, had weeds growing up through the tracks. The only new thing in town was silence, and it was everywhere. I passed people I used to know. Some looked up, then looked away. Others nodded faintly, their eyes sliding past me like I was part of a memory they didn't want to relive. One man, I think his name was Carl, stopped, stared at the patch on my jacket and said, "Didn't think you'd made it back." And that was it. He moved on, as if nothing needed to follow. The church bell tower stood tall, but the bell no longer rang. I remembered how it used to toll every Sunday morning, calling folks to worship. Now the silence felt like an empty sermon. First Baptist Church, once the heart of this town, looked like it had stopped beating too. Then I turned onto Maple Street. Her house came into view like a bruise, something tender, once familiar, now aching to touch. The shutters were closed. The garden was overgrown. The mailbox sagged on its post. I knew every creak in that front porch, every step up to the door. I used to sit there with her in the evening, drinking lemonade while fireflies danced in the yard, and we made plans we had no business believing in. I stood at the gate, my hand resting on the latch, and listened for the sound of her voice. A laugh, maybe, or her calling to the dog. But there was nothing, not even the old dog, just the wind, the porch swing gone. Then the neighbor's screen door opened across the street. It was Mrs. Evans. She used to make peach pie in the summer and leave slices on her windowsill to cool. Her hair was thinner now, her back more bent, but she still wore that same apron covered in flower stains. She looked at me like a ghost. "You come back," she said after a long silence. "Guess the papers were wrong." I didn't answer. I didn't know how. She waited. "A while," she continued. "Then word came through the church, missing in action, presumed dead, wasn't much else to do. She married Frank Lambert, from the mill. They live out near the river now." Frank Lambert. I'd punched him once in high school for tripping her in the hallway. Now he was raising the life I promised her. "She has a boy," Mrs. Evans added, almost apologetically. "About 2. Name's Paul, I think." I nodded slowly. She waited for me to say something, maybe ask for directions, maybe get angry, maybe cry. But I just tipped my hat and walked away. I walked for hours, through the back roads, down past the old mill pond, past the cornfields that no one planted this year. I walked until the sun dropped behind the silos, until the shadows stretched longer than the fences, until I couldn't feel the boots on my feet or the weight in my chest. Everything looked the same, but everything was different. I was the ghost now, walking through a life that had already grieved me, buried me and moved on. And somehow, that hurt more than dying would have. I remember the night I wrote her that letter, the one I carried through every mile of Europe, folded and unfolded until the edges wore thin, until her name looked like it had been written by a trembling child. We were camped outside a ruined monastery near Anzio, the sky above choked with smoke and the kind of silence that doesn't belong to peace, but to something worse. The kind of silence that follows after someone stops screaming. I'd found a scrap of paper in my coat, a pencil stub in my pack, and I wrote under the light of a burning truck. Not because it was romantic. It wasn't. Heat stung my eyes and made my hands sweat. But something in me needed to speak to her, needed to remember the sound of her name, the shape of her handwriting, the promise I made before I stepped onto the ship in Norfolk. I wrote, "Wait for me. I'm coming back. I'll build you that porch, plant you a garden, fix the roof before the snow comes. We'll have kids, a boy and a girl maybe. I want to teach them how to fish, how to pray, how to laugh without fear." It was a small dream. But it was the only thing I had that didn't explode or bleed or vanish in the middle of the night. Most of the guys had their own rituals. Some carried photos. Some wrote letters they never mailed. One guy carved his girl's name into his rifle stock. I carried that letter, her letter, the one she sent me the day I left. It smelled like cedar and perfume. It said, "Come back to me whole." But war doesn't leave you whole. In Monte Cassino, I watched a man die with his mouth open like he was trying to sing. I watched a priest lose his faith over a crater. I watched an entire unit dig trenches in frozen ground while whispering the names of women they hadn't seen in years. At night, when the shelling stopped and the fires went out, I'd lie with my back to the earth and pretend I was home. I'd imagine her beside me, fingers laced with mine, whispering about what color to paint the kitchen or how many eggs the hens laid that day. Sometimes I could hear her laugh in the wind. Sometimes I'd wake up reaching for her. The only thing that got me through those months was the promise, the one I made on her front porch with the stars spinning above us and the crickets loud in the dark. I had said it without thinking, "No matter what happens over there, I'll come back and give you a home." And she had looked at me with eyes full of everything I didn't know how to name and said, "Then that's all I need." So I held on to that. Through Sicily, through Rome, through the smell of blood and oil and coffee burned on ration fires. Even when the news came that we'd lost more men, that the next town had been flattened, that someone else's brother wouldn't be coming home, I kept that letter close, pressed it to my chest when I slept, held it in my palm before we moved out. It wasn't paper anymore, it was a shield. There were days I doubted I'd survive, nights I didn't want to. But every time I thought about letting go, I'd remember that promise. The house, the swing set, the dog, the morning coffee, with her hand brushing mine. You don't fight for countries. Not really. You fight for what's waiting, or what you hope is still waiting. When the war finally ended, and they told us we were going home, I didn't cheer like the others. I just sat there, staring at my boots, wondering if she was still standing on that porch, if she still wore that ribbon in her hair, if she had kept the dress I liked, the blue one with the white buttons. I carried that letter all the way back across the Atlantic, through customs, through the bus ride, through the long walk from the station to her street. My hands were calloused, my heart unsure, but my promise was intact. I had no idea that by the time I made it back to that house with the green shutters, the world I'd built in my mind had already been torn down. It was a Sunday morning when I saw her sister again. The church bell had finally rung for the first time in months, soft, hesitant, like even it wasn't sure it was still welcome. I hadn't planned on attending the service, but something pulled me down that road, past the rusted bikes on front porches and the Sunday dresses fluttering in the wind. Maybe it was habit. Maybe it was hope. She stood alone by the steps of the church, her sister Mary. I hadn't seen her in 4 years, but time had etched itself into her face like wind carving a stone. Her hair was pulled back in the same old braid, though now streaked with grey. Her eyes didn't widen when she saw me. They just softened, like something heavy had finally landed where it belonged. She didn't say my name, just nodded once and turned toward the gravel path that led behind the cemetery, down to the edge of the woods. I followed without asking why. We ended up at the old milk shed behind the pastor's house. It was dark, cool, quiet. Dust floated in the air like memory. She sat on a broken crate, pulled a handkerchief from her sleeve, and held it in her lap like a shield. "I suppose someone had to tell you," she said finally. "And I guess it has to be me." She didn't look at me, just stared at the floorboards, like the truth was hidden in the wood grain. "After your last letter stopped coming, folks started saying maybe you weren't coming back. The church got notice you'd gone missing in Italy. Nothing official, just one of those presumed lost telegrams. There was a service, small, closed casket kind of grief." I felt the air thicken. I remembered her last letter, her handwriting full of life, even in fear. I never stopped writing. The mail must have stopped carrying my name. "She didn't stop hoping," Mary continued. "She waited that whole year. Wouldn't speak to anyone about it. Kept your picture by the window, but then came the winter. The food ran low. Their mother got sick. She had to find work, help pay doctor bills." Mary paused. Her fingers twisted the edge of the handkerchief until it looked like rope. "And then Frank Lambert started coming around. You remember him?" I did. Too well. He had a job at the mill, steady income. Brought flour, firewood. Said he'd marry her and help with the bills. Said he understood. He said no at first, Mary whispered. Said she didn't want a life with a man she didn't love. But when their mother took that turn and the doctor said there wasn't much time, well, love starts to look like a luxury. I felt something collapse inside me. Not anger, not betrayal, just a kind of quiet defeat. "She had the baby that fall," Mary said. "His name's Paul. She told me once, before he was born, that if it was a boy, she'd name him after your grandfather. That's how I knew." I looked up at her. "He's mine." Mary didn't answer. She just reached into her coat pocket and handed me a small, weathered notebook. I opened it slowly. Inside were drawings, crayon sketches of a man in uniform standing under a tree, holding hands with a boy. One page said, in shaky block letters, "My daddy. He smiles like the sun." My hands trembled as I turned the pages. "She never told Frank," Mary said softly. "He always thought the boy was his. But Paul always said his dreams were about someone else. A soldier. A man who whistled when he walked. A man with your face." I closed the notebook and held it against my chest. They moved east last year, she added. Frank got transferred to a bigger mill outside Pittsburgh. Took them both. She didn't fight it. Maybe she couldn't. Maybe she thought she didn't have the right anymore. Tried to speak, but the words stuck to the roof of my mouth. She still writes letters, Mary said. I don't know if she sends them, but she writes them, keeps them in a box under her bed. I saw your name on every envelope. Outside, a bird sang. A train whistle called somewhere far off. The world moved on like it always does. She thought she lost you, Mary said again, but maybe it was both of you who got lost. I sat there for a long time. I thought about that letter in my pocket, about the swing I never built, the garden we never planted, the child who drew me from memory, though he never heard my voice. And I realized I didn't come back to reclaim anything. I came back to understand what was taken. I found her standing near the far edge of the cemetery, where the tall oaks leaned in over the hillside and the stones grew smaller, older, harder to read, as if time had decided that some names didn't need remembering anymore. She was placing a bundle of wildflowers, Queen Anne's lace mostly, with a few daisies, at the base of a marker that had no name. Just a small, flat stone. The kind they give when the family can't afford more, or when they don't want the world to ask too many questions. She didn't turn when she heard my steps crunch across the gravel. She didn't need to. Stopped a few feet away, unsure whether I belonged here, unsure whether I ever had. She stood still for a moment longer, her back to me, and when she finally turned, I saw that her eyes hadn't changed. They were softer maybe, more tired, ringed with the kind of grief that doesn't scream or flinch but just stays. A quiet, constant ache that never leaves a woman who's lost more than one kind of love. She looked at me like she was seeing a memory, not a man. Not quite a ghost, not quite alive, something in between. I didn't know if you'd really come, she said. I tried to answer, but nothing I could say would have mattered. I waited, she added, a long time, until the second winter. Then the letter came from the Red Cross, missing, presumed dead. And I thought that was the end of our story. I wanted to ask her why she didn't keep waiting, why she didn't fight harder, why she let someone else step into the space where I was supposed to stand, but I already knew the answers. The ration books, the cold nights, her mother's illness, the whispering neighbors, the sheer weight of surviving alone. I kept your letters, she said. All of them, even when the ink faded, even when they stopped making sense, even when I remarried. I kept them in a box under the floorboards. I'd take them out at night and read them when I couldn't sleep. I reached into my coat and pulled out the small notebook her sister had given me. She looked at it like it might burn her. I've seen it, she said softly. He used to draw like that all the time, said the man in his dreams smiled like the sun, said he wasn't afraid when the man was near. She didn't cry, neither did I, but something broke between us. Not loudly, not violently, but with the kind of cracking sound you only hear when a tree finally falls in the forest, years after the lightning strike. I never told him who you were, she continued. Frank. He never asked, and by the time I wanted to tell the truth, it felt too late, like I'd already buried too much. And I opened the notebook again, flipped through pages of crayon sketches, some of them joyful, some strange and sad. There was one drawing of a man in a uniform holding hands with a boy under a tree, and it stopped me cold. The figure was smiling. The boy's hair matched mine. You named him Paul, I said, after my grandfather. She nodded. I couldn't say it aloud, but yes, I had to leave you somewhere in him. We sat in silence beside the grave. Not hers, not mine, just a place that felt like it belonged to the life we never got to live. I don't know how long we sat there. At one point the wind picked up, rustling the leaves above us in that low, whispering way that sounds like voices from another time. Her hand brushed mine, not in romance, not in apology, but in recognition, in quiet surrender. I loved you, she said finally. I never stopped. But love doesn't always win, does it? No, I said. It just lingers. We didn't kiss. We didn't promise anything. We just sat there, shoulder to shoulder, as the sun dipped behind the church spire, and the shadows stretched across the grass like fingers reaching for the past. The boy I dreamed of, the porch swing, the dog, the garden, they were still there, somewhere, but not for me, not anymore, and maybe that was okay. And I went back to my father's land, the place with the broken gate and the chimney that still stood, even though the house around it had given up long ago. The grass had grown wild, knee-high in places, and the wind that passed through the trees sounded different now, like it was humming a tune only I could recognize. Something half-remembered, like a lullaby my mother used to sing before the war turned everything into marching and maps. There was nothing waiting for me there, no family, no neighbors, just the red soil, the bones of old fence posts, and the creak of the windmill that hadn't drawn water in a decade. But I walked the fields anyway, letting the tall grass brush against my hands, letting the silence speak. I took the notebook with me, the one with Paul's drawings. I placed it inside a wooden box and buried it beneath the oak tree behind the barn. I didn't need a grave or a monument. That box wasn't for mourning, it was for remembering, for telling the earth that something lived here once, a hope, a love, a boy who dreamed of a man with a smile like the sun. Then I picked up the hoe. The soil was dry but willing. I turned it row by row just like my father used to. I planted beets, not because I loved them, but because I once told her I would. I said we'd plant beets and tomatoes and children in the same garden. And though the children never came, and she wasn't here to lean over the fence and laugh at the rows I planted crooked, I planted them anyway. There's a kind of peace in doing the thing you promised, even when it no longer matters to anyone else. At night, I sit on the old porch steps. The boards groan beneath me, and the stars above are the same ones I stared at on the other side of the world, back when I still believed that coming home meant everything would fall back into place. I know better now. Sometimes I imagine Paul, older now, maybe drawing pictures of someone else, maybe forgetting the dreams he once had. I hope he's safe. I hope he's kind. I hope he never learns the taste of war on the back of his tongue. But if he ever comes looking, there'll be something here. A box beneath an oak tree, a row of crooked beets, a silence that's full, not empty. I didn't get the house. I didn't get the family. I didn't get the swing on the porch or the dog sleeping under the steps. But I kept the promise. Not because it changed anything, but because it still meant something. We share stories like this every day, real voices of love, loss, and the quiet strength that carries us forward. Subscribe to the channel for more stories that stay with you long after they're told.